We are in Perek Yud Daled of Sefer Yehoshua. It's a Perek that's continuing, obviously, in the story of the division of the land of Israel between the tribes. Where we had left it off was last week, where we talked about Transjordan, about the 2.5 tribes. And now we're going to be moving into the main section of Eretz Yisrael. And when we move into this main section of Eretz Yisrael, we begin with the word Ve'ela, and these. Now, where "and these" comes from is really, if you look back 2 psukim to the previous chapter, to Yud Gimel, Pasuk Lamed Bet, it said, "Ela asher nichal Moshe barvot Moav me'ever liYarden Yericho mizracha." These were the cities that were divided by Moshe Rabbeinu in the Transjordan area. Okay, and then Ve'elem, and these, this is the beginning of this chapter, Asher Nachalu v'nei Yisrael be'Eretz Canaan, are the areas that were given to the Jews in the main portion of Eretz Yisrael, to the west of the Jordan River. This is the explanation of the Abarbanel, and the Abarbanel actually goes further, and he talks about the fact that there is this comparison that occurs between what Moshe had done and now what's going to be happening in terms of the main portion of Eretz Yisrael. Asher nichalu otam Elazar Kohen v'Yoshua bin Nun, which were, instead of Moshe being in charge, now it's the kind of thing where Elazar Kohen and Yehoshua are managing the division of the land, and also the heads of the subsets of the tribes themselves were all part of this process. What's fascinating about it also, if you notice, in terms of the way we describe this, it's Elazar comes before Yehoshua. This is Sefer Yehoshua. This is the story of Yehoshua. But Elazar comes before, because now we're also making another transition. In the Chumash, with just a few exceptions, it was always Moshe ve'Aharon. Moshe was first, and then his brother Aaron. Now we're going into more of a normal form of leadership, not where you have the greatest of all prophets, Moshe, but now when we have a more normal, a regular great leader, Yehoshua. And when you have a regular great person, well, Kohanim come first. Kohanim are always the ones who come first, and so Elazar is written first. And this is going to be 2.5 tribes over there, and then we get very creative math, by the way. Only in Jewish life will we have such creative math. How many tribes are there?
Well,
13. Thank you. Okay, there's actually 14 if you want to go with 14. Yeah, how do we get 13 or 14? Well, we start out with 12 tribes. There were 12 children who were born to Yaakov. Okay, however, at one point, Yaakov goes ahead. Kiruvain v'Shimon Yuli, Ephraim Menashe Kiruvain v'Shimon Yuli. He goes ahead and he divides up the tribe of Yosef into two. Well, if you divide the tribe of Yosef into two, you now have a situation where you have 13 tribes. Now, you could also talk about the fact, by the way, that we have Kohanim and Leviim, but I'll keep that easier. That's how you'd start talking about 14. There's 14 divisions, but not really tribes. But you do have 13 tribes. And so part of this process is going to be, well, I have 13 tribes. How do I get back to the number 12? And then I make it even more complicated, where Moshe Rabbeinu takes Menashe and divides them in half in Transjordan and half in the mainland of Eretz Yisrael. So if I have 2.5 tribes on the side of the Transjordan, how many tribes will I still have in the mainland of Israel to get to 9.5? The way I get to 9.5 is, I'm sorry, to get to 12, it's 9.5 tribes to go. Menashe is going to be that half, right? So I have, and then I have Yosef is still going to have the representation of Ephraim. And Levi is not going to get any portion. Levi will say over and over again, as we said last week, will not be getting a portion. Just to move forward, Begoral Nachlatam, the way the land was divided up was via a Goral. Now, I did provide for you the article that comes from the Encyclopedia Talmudit on Goral. Now, Goral has a lot of different uses within Jewish life, how they would use a lottery. One of the more famous ones is the Goral was the usage, for example, that was done at the time of Yom Kippur. Remember, determining which of the two of those rams were going to be thrown off the cliff, the Seir LaAzazel, the scapegoat versus the goat that was going to be sacrificed in the Beit HaMikdash was also the basis of a lottery. So here, within that general entry of Goral, of lottery, there's a sub-entry which deals with the division of the land. And I'm just going to read it and translate it with you because it really summarizes most of this conversation actually comes from the Gemara in Bava Batra. If you see where the arrow is, that's where I'm starting. Mhm. And it says, Eretz Yisrael nitchalkal pi goral. The land of Israel was divided by a goral. Shenemar, because there's a pasuk that teaches this fact. The pasuk is found in Bamidbar. It's ach begoral yechalek et haaretz. Only by a goral will you divide up the land. V'namar v'yishlach Yehoshua goral b'shilo lifnei Hashem. And we will encounter in Perek Yudchet and Sefer Yehoshua that Yehoshua actually does this goral process. But also, the land was only divided via the prophecy of the Urim V'Tumim, of the breastplate and its signals that would be given from the Kohen Gadol. Well, how do you do the two of them? Well, first of all, we know al pi hagoral. First of all, shenemar al pi hagoral, al pi mashma al pi Urim V'Tumim. The language in the pasuk which says by the word, in essence, of the goral, indicates that by the word al-pi, or according to, indicates that the Urim V'Tumim are included in this. So how can you divide the land both by the Urim V'Tumim and by a goral, and it was both by prophecy and by a goral? Elazar meluvash b'Urim V'Tumim. Elazar Kohen was the high priest. He was the Kohen Gadol. He's wearing the Urim V'Tumim. V'Yehoshua v'chol Yisrael omdim lefanav. And Yehoshua and the rest of the Jewish people are across from him. V'kalfi shel shvatim v'kalfi shel tchumim munachim lefanav. And he has two baskets. One basket has the names of all the tribes, and one basket has the names of all the regions. Vayamechaven beruach hakodesh v'omer zvulun ole tchum akom ole imo. And then there was this prophecy of Ruach HaKodesh, which said, for example, the tribe of Zvulun will get the area of Akko. Taraf, Irbev, Bekalfi Shel Shvatim V'ala Biyado Zvulun. Then they pick from the two baskets. And after they announce that Zvulun is going to get Akko, they pick, and out comes the lot, which has Zvulun's name of it. Taraf bekalfi shel tchumin, then they pick from the other basket, v'ala biyado tchum Akko. And then comes Akko. So you have both a prophetic pronouncement and you have the lottery happening at the same time. And then you have the same piece that happens where you have another tribe, Naphtali, and Naphtali is going to get Ginosar, Taraf Bekalfi Shel Shvatim. You mix up in the basket of the names of the Shvatim, V'alabi Ado Naphtali, and the name Naphtali comes out, Taraf Bekalfi Shel Tchumim. You mix up in the basket of regions, V'alabi Ado Tchum Ginosar, V'chein Kol Shevet V'Shevet. And this is the process that would happen with each Shvatim. Ushnei Pirchei Kuna Hayu Omdim, and there were two young Kohanim in training, litrof b'kalpiot, and they would actually be mixing up these baskets. And went up and down, and this is how they were able to merit or get these different pieces. But before all of this happened, there was the question asked of the Urim V'Tumim. Before anything was mixed in the lotteries, so that the Jews wouldn't get all upset about things, that it would remain calm. Because they would see that there was this prophetic pronouncement, and that the exact same thing happened by a lottery. And that where they know it's honest. And therefore, when larger tribes would go ahead and get a portion, there wasn't any kind of commotion that happened. So it was a two-part process. There's more here, but we'll leave it for a different time. It's a two-part process, and that two-part process ensured that there was a sense of honesty going on, that a prophetic pronouncement using the Urim V'Tumim would announce first what was going to happen, and then the very same thing happened by lottery. Well, it no longer is a matter of chance because you have a prophecy. It's no longer a matter of chance. And on the other hand, you can't say it was a fix with the prophecy because look what just happened. You had this lottery working, and the lottery came up the same way. So it was nowadays we have the two-stage verification when we're trying to get into certain websites. Okay, well, this was a two-stage verification in terms of the division of the tribes themselves. So back into the pasuk, begoral nachalatam. The way they determined their portions was via this lottery. Kasher tzivah Hashem b'yad Moshe, and it was done precisely like Hashem had commanded Moshe, and that goes back to the pasuk in Bamidbar, and it's trying to again all the time connect what's happening in Sefer Yehoshua as part of the prophecy that was given to Moshe. It provides that ultimate of legitimacies. L'tishat hamatot v'chatzi hamata. Now it's to the 9.5 tribes. Ki natan Moshe nachalat shnei hamatot v'chatzi hamata be'ever HaYarden. Because Moshe had already divided to the 2.5 tribes on the other side. And he didn't give anything to the Leviim. So just like Moshe did on the other side of the Jordan, Yehoshua is going to do. He's not going to give anything to the Leviim, and he's going to give to the other half of that tribe. Because, let's not forget, says the Navi, Ephraim and Manasseh had been divided up into 2 tribes. They had their own portions, not just the portion of a single tribe of Yosef. And the only thing we gave to the Levim were specific cities. All told, it was 42 cities of the Leviim plus 6 Arei Miklat. They had 48 cities in which the Leviim lives, divided up among all of Eretz Yisrael, north, south, both sides of the Jordan River. And they received those cities, and they received Migrasheim, the areas around for their flocks, and also for other things they possessed. Now, it's just an interesting side note. Migrashem. To this day, we talk about a migrash. A migrash is an area. A migrash is an area around a home, an area around something else. And on this, what's just interesting, migrashem, the Mitzudat Sion points out here, why is it called a migrash? The shoresh is gimel resh shin, ligaresh, to exile, to push out. Because in a way, you have the fortified city with the walls around it. On the outside of the city, it looks as if these things are on the outside, the fields and the other buildings outside the city, as if they were pushed out, as if they were exiled from the main part of the city, even though that's not the case. It's just the way we built the cities. Exactly the way Moshe had commanded. All of the details. Now, the Malbim says this isn't just what we're mentioning here, but all the rest of the details that were going to be taking place were all done according to Moshe. Again, the second time we're already mentioning Moshe. We even open up with a reference to what Moshe had done elsewhere. All of this over and over again is providing that legitimacy. Vayigshu b'nei Yehuda al Yehoshua b'Gilgal. Now comes, before we actually do the rest of the division, a story. Now, the word vayigash is a fascinating word. It means to come closer. The most classic case of vayigash, which we have in the Chumash, is Parshat Vayigash. Vayigash elav Yehuda. If you remember, it was in the story where Yosef is still the viceroy of Egypt, Tzafnat Paneach, and the brothers are there, and Yosef is taking his hard stance. He's going to keep Binyamin with him just to prove that they're telling the truth. And at this point, the brothers know that all will be lost, and this will be the final straw for their father. And so Vayigash elav Yehuda, Yehuda shows the strength, and he approaches, and according to some of the Meforshim, he confronts this viceroy of Egypt, and that's when Yosef reveals himself to his brothers. Interestingly, with his offspring, we use the same terminology, Vayigshu v'nei Yehuda Yehoshua b'Gilgal. The tribe of Yehuda once again does this Vayigash moment, and they go up to Yehoshua in Gilgal. Gilgal is the place where the Mishkan was. It was the meeting place, a little bit north of Yericho, if you recall. And there in Gilgal was the Mishkan, and that means that this is where all of the division of land was taking place. This is where the Urim V'Tumim would be, where the Kohen Gadol would be with all of his vestments. And so Vayigshu elav, to go ahead and they step forward. Now, why are they stepping forward? Well, we'll see in just a minute, but it could be, again, using the previous paradigm back in Sefer Bereshit, it could be a confrontation or it could be a request, a simple request. Vayomer Elav. And so they tell to Yehoshua, Kalev ben Yefuneh HaKenizi, the head of our tribe, Kalev, אתה ידעת את הדבר אשר דיבר השם אל משה איש אלוקים על אודותי ועל אודותיך בקדש ברנע. In other words, Kate mentions, he says, Kalev says, you know what happened back there in Kadesh Barnea. Now, the interesting thing, you know what happened back in Kadesh Barnea. Well, we know what happened back in Kadesh Barnea, and Yehoshua knows what happens back in Kadesh Barnea. But for some reason, the Navi decides not to say what happened. That's the story of the Meraglim. The story of the Meraglim that happened in the second year of the Jews' exodus from Egypt, where they came back and they gave the Dibara, the evil report about Eretz Yisrael, and where the punishment was that they were going to wander for the 40 years in the desert. There were the two who stood up, Yehoshua and Kalev. We have heard about Yehoshua in all of these intervening years. Kalev has been silent. We haven't seen or heard from him. There's a couple of references to him, but the references are back to earlier events. He has left the stage in essence. And now he steps back on the stage in this moment. And the statement is, you know what happened. Now, why don't they say what exactly happened? So again, the Abarbanel has a fascinating theory. The Abarbanel says, listen, this was a tragic moment in Jewish history. This was a massive failure of the Jewish people. It led to the deaths of an entire generation of men between the age of 20 and 60. And to go ahead and at this point bring it up when the Jews are on the top of the world, they've finished 7 years of conquest, they're about ready to inherit the entire land. And what are they bringing it up for? The people he's talking to are the children of those who failed. There's no need to really be explicit about this. Everyone knew about it, and you just reference it. And you reference it by saying, you know, and I know what happened back there at that time. Okay. Says, and then he continues, Ben Arbaim Shana Nochi Bishloach Moshe Eved Hashem Oti Mikadesh Barnea L'Ragel Et Haaretz. I was 40 years old when Moshe Rabbeinu sent me to spy out the land. Va'ashevoto davar kasherim levavi. And I was 40 years old when I reported back to him that which was on my heart. Now, that which was on my heart is different than that which is in my mouth and that which was in my eyes. In other words, Kalev says to Yehoshua, look, you remember the incident, and you remember that I remained true to my heart in my report. Now, I saw, and again, I'm building off of the Abarbanel, I saw exactly the same thing that the other spies had seen. They interpreted it as a sign that there was no way we could conquer the land. I stood up and I went with my heart. My heart is part of my sense of belief, my sense of trust in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Vayahas Kalev, that when all of the nation was making the tumult, Kalev steps up and gets everyone quiet. And he says, we can do this. So Kalev says, you remember that moment. You remember I went with my heart, not with logic, not with my mind, not with what people were saying. I went with my heart, and I was able to defend HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And because I did this, V'achai asher alui mi, himsived lev ha'am. My other brethren, the other spies who went with me, they melted away the hearts of the people. In other words, they made them scared. I was the one who stayed and remained faithful to God. As a result, Moshe Rabbeinu on that day made a promise. Im lo haaretz asher dercha raglecha ba, lecha tieh lenachala ulevanecha ad olam. And the words of Im lo, if not, okay, is the words of an oath that he took, that the places where you went, where your feet crossed, will be for you and for your offspring as an inheritance. Now, where was the place where he walked? Well, this is Hebron. We're going to be talking about Hebron. And how do we know it? Because interestingly, we don't find these words in the Chumash. What Kalev is telling Yehoshua is something that isn't in the Chumash directly, even though we all heard about it so many times. We talk about it so many times because of what we now know in Sefer Yehoshua. So we know it was Hebron because there's a pasuk in Bamidbar in Yud Gimel where it says Vayalu Banegev, that the spies came up from the south, Vayavo ad Hebron, and he came up to Hebron. It starts in the plural and ends that phrase in the singular. They all went up, but only one of them went into Hebron. And the reason why only one of them went up to Hebron is because there were the giants. It was a fearsome nation who lived in Hebron. Kalev was the only one who went. He went by himself into Hebron. And Moshe Rabbeinu, after Kalev stood up for the people and after all the rest of the nation were punished, and he said that only two people are going to live from that generation who were between the ages of 20 and 60. It was Yehoshua and Kalev. He promised Kalev that he would get the place where he went. He promised you would get Hebron. Ki mileti acharei Hashem Elokai. Exactly because what he'd said in the earlier pasuk, because I was whole, I was fully with God. Ve'ata. And so now Kalev says to Yehoshua, Hinei hechaya Hashem oti kasher diber ze 45 shana. God gave me the opportunity to live for the past 45 years. Now, how do we get to 45 years? This is an important, by the way, statement in chronology. We know Kalev gives his age as 40 when the story of the spies happened. We know that was in the second year in the desert, which means they're wandering 40 years in the desert. How many more years will there be in the desert? 38 plus, right? 38 years. We know he's saying he's 45. That means there were 7 years since they had left the desert. That's the 7 years which we identify as the 7 years of conquest. It's based on this pasuk that Chazal are able to say that there were 7 years of conquest, and ultimately there were 7 years that took to divide the land. Yeah.
But how did he got Hebron? But how did somebody else might have had in the Gladry?
So it's good. So it works out. What's going to work out is Hebron is going to be within the area of the tribe of Yehuda that Kalev is from. Okay, but who gets Hebron? Who gets Hebron? In other words, the division, by the way, by families was also divided up. He's going to get that piece of Hebron as his. And by the way, your nothing gained is actually a great question because we already encountered Hebron, and we'll see it in a minute. I'll get to it in a minute. Back in Yud Aleph, in the conquest of Yehoshua, talks about Hebron, and Hebron is going to be one of the cities of refuge, one of the Arei Miklat, which means that the city of Hebron proper will be given to the Levim. Kalev is not going to get the city proper. He's going to get all of the region of Hebron. And that region of Hebron he will get, and we have to talk about who conquered it or didn't. But he gets that specific space, whereas the tribe of Yehuda, to make sure within the tribe of Yehuda he gets that piece. Me'az diber Hashem et hadavar hazel Moshe asher alach Yisrael bamidbar. And now it's been 45 years from when Moshe made the promise to me, and the time of the period of time that we've been going through the desert. Well, I was 40 when this episode happened. It's 45 years later. I am now 85 years old, says Kalev. Okay. 85 years old. And notice what he says next. I am just as strong and healthy as I was on the day that Moshe Rabbeinu had sent me on the mission. Why does he need to say that? Because he's asking for Hebron. Well, to ask for Hebron means there's going to be some work involved. This is not something that's simple. There has to be some conquests that are going to take place. There has to be the issue of settlement. And Yehoshua could, this is the Mitzudat David, he says, Yehoshua could go ahead and say, listen, I'm sorry, you're 85, you're old. How are you going to do what you want to do? And Kalev says, I'm 85 and I'm strong. And my strength of then is the same as it is today. La milchama v'latzeit v'lavo. I'm ready to battle. I'm ready to come in. I'm ready to go out. I'm ready to take care of this. Don't use it as an excuse, Yehoshua, that I can't do it anymore. Moshe promised it to me. You know better than anyone else that Moshe promised it to me. I want it. And therefore, the pasuk continues, I want that mountain of Chevron. Asher diber Hashem bayomahu, which God spoke of. Ki ata shamata bayomahu, you heard it on that day. Ki anakim sham varim gedolot b'tzurot, and despite the fact that you heard that there are giants there and there are fortified cities there, ulai Hashem otiv horashtem kasher diber Hashem. You know, maybe God is going to give it to me. Maybe I'll be able to be successful. I want to have this land. Now, what I'd mentioned before, back in Perek Yud Aleph and Pasuk Chaf Aleph, we say that Yehoshua actually conquered Hebron. So one of the Balei Tosfos, he says what's happening is what we had back in Yud Aleph is the famous principle of Ein Mukdam Muchar B'Torah. We're going to see that Kalev is going to conquer Hebron. It's going to be reported on in the next chapter. So in chapter 11, it says Yehoshua conquered. In chapter 15, it says Kalev conquered. First of all, when was it conquered? So the read says it's conquered when Kalev conquers it. But why does Yehoshua get the credit back in Yud Aleph? Because back in Yud Aleph, we're not giving individuals credit. Back in Yud Aleph, it is Yehoshua. In other words, it was conquered under the military leadership of Yehoshua. Yehoshua gets the credit, and we find this often in Tanakh, where whoever the leader is gets the credit or gets the blame. Okay, and so Yehoshua, the fact that it's in Yud Aleph doesn't mean it was already conquered. It's just there. It's a statement that's out of order. Tetvav's next parak is when Kalev is going to conquer it after he gets the permission from Yehoshua, but Yehoshua will get the credit because it's all part of his leadership at that point. Vayivarchehu Yehoshua. Yehoshua gave a bracha to Kalev. Vayiten et Chevron leKalev ben Yefuneh lenachala. And he gave to Kalev the area of Chevron to be his inheritance. Notice that we talk about back and forth. We have Kalev, then we have Kalev ben Yefuneh. All of a sudden we have his full name, because this is like a legal transaction. This is a major moment, and so we use his full name. He gave it to him at that point, and he gave him the chance to be able to conquer the land. So going back to the earlier part, to Pasuk Vav of all of this, when the tribe of Yehuda stepped forward, Vayigshu v'nei Yehuda. Why do we use that terminology? How do you explain it as confrontation, and how do you explain it just as a fact of support? So I can say on the one side, I can say, no, Yehuda at this point was concerned because Kalev, their leader, was 85 years old. And at 85 years old, they were concerned that Yehoshua may have set this whole agenda item on the back burner. He may have tabled it saying, Kalev can't do it. I'm not going to go with it. So it could be Vayigshu, just like when Yehuda confronted the viceroy of Egypt. It could also be supportive. Hirsch suggests that Kalev was a person who wasn't going to make a tumult. He was depending on Yehoshua. But the reality is things are moving along pretty fast, and Yehoshua hasn't stepped up and hasn't said, Kalev, come on over here. I got to give you a Chevron. And so according to Hirsch, what's going on here is Vayikshu Elav Yehuda, they're coming actually, they're taking the initiative to support their leader. They want to make sure that their leader feels that he can make this request because he was a modest person. Kalev wasn't the kind of person to make those kind of demands, and so they're supporting him. And therefore, we say this portion was for Kalev ben Yefuneh ad hayom hazeh, until the time when this sefer was written. Ya'an asher milei acharei Hashem Elokei Yisrael, because he had been complete with God. Notice it's the third time in this section where we use that same terminology. We used it in verse 8. Vanochi mileti acharei Hashem Elokai. We used it in verse 9. Ki mileti achrei Hashem Elokai, because I was complete with God. And now he says, because he was complete with God, he got it. This is the way the Navi is making sure we get the message. Okay. These kinds of things don't happen just by accident. These happen because people have been totally faithful and have been together with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's why it happens. V'shem Chevron lefanim Kiryat Arba. And now we have one more piece. One more piece is an interesting piece, that the name of Chevron had been Kiryat Arba. Oh, now today we have the modern city of Kiryat Arba on the outskirts of Hebron, named for this point. Why? Ha'adam Agadol Banakim Hu. Because Arba was the name of the leader of this tribe of Anakim, of giants. Va'aret Shaktam Milchama. And then there's a statement that the land was quiet from war. Now, where does this fit in? The land was quiet from war. So the Radak says that the land was quiet from war. They stopped fighting. That this is actually a pejorative statement against the Jewish people. We know from last week, from the previous parak, we know from all of the descriptions, there were still many of the nations who were occupying sections of the land of Canaan. The Canaan hadn't been totally conquered. Unfortunately, according to the Radak, there was no more war. They declared a ceasefire much too early in the process. And because they declared that ceasefire, they stopped fighting. It wasn't negotiated. Because they stopped fighting too early, therefore we would have troubles later on. That's the Radak. Rashi takes the exact opposite approach. Rashi takes the approach, no, this is a celebratory statement. That at that point, the Amoraim, the people from Amorah, they had given in, they had surrendered after 7 years of battle, and now it's time to start building. Now, Va'aret Shaktam Milchaman, the reason why there can be a debate on this is we don't know really why it says this here. I could understand it being said earlier, but after this issue with Kalev, why does it pop in all of a sudden here in Kalev? Is it trying to say, for example, Kalev was ready to fight, but there were no other battles in the land? Kalev is the paradigm of heroics of what we should be doing, or is it unrelated to the story of Kalev? We don't know. We're not sure, and that's the beauty of learning Tanakh. And this is the end of this parak. Next week, we're going to be getting into the lottery itself. A lot of maps we have coming up for a few prakim, and after that, we're going to continue with the rest of the story of Yehoshua. Okay, so next week, same time, same place.